came up with this years ago because we really think people get ahead of themselves in dealing with FOIA, okay? So the first step is the entity you're dealing with, a covered entity. For the most part, when Ray and I talk on FOIA, about FOIA to different groups, we're assuming it's a governmental entity that's subject to FOIA. Private entities, you probably know, there are records that private entities have. There are theoretically, not much case law on this, meetings that private entities would have. So private entities in some circumstances, we think, can in some respects be subject to FOIA. I don't really have time to go into that, but just so you know, it takes direct public funding plus something more to get access to records that are being held by a private entity. There are some procedural questions about how you go about getting records that are being held by a private entity. And if anybody got questions about that, that could be like another 20 minutes probably by itself. So most of the time this morning, we're going to be talking about entities like county government, city government, state agencies like that, where there's really no question that, you know, if they have the records, and if the records are, no exemption applies, they're supposed to be providing the records to a citizen who makes that request. So we're assuming step one here is met for most of our talk. Step two, very important, you don't get to step three until you've gone past step two. Is the record I want, does it meet the definition of a public record, which you'll get at here momentarily? Is the meeting I want a covered meeting by FOIA? Does it meet the definition of a meeting under FOIA? If so, then you go to step three. Okay, fine, but does an exemption apply? Might the record be exempt from public disclosure? Might the meeting still be closed to the public? Don't get ahead of yourself. We find out with agencies particularly, I mean, they're going to the exemptions and they haven't first decided. And we don't want you, anybody on the side of making a FOIA request, to be frustrated and thinking that because you've made a request for a public record that you just are going to get access. An exemption might come into play. So let's flesh this out. Excuse me, that was quick. Woo, that thing is touchy. I'm sorry. What is a public record? Here's a definition. It's a big, long definition under the Act. Okay, unlike meetings, which I'll get to momentarily, the records definition is pretty lengthy. And it's pretty helpful. There are still questions that come up. We've tried to break it down into the elements of what is a public record. Now again, remember, just because they call it a public record doesn't necessarily mean it's open to the public. We're still in step two here. An exemption might still apply. But what we're wanting, we have to make sure still, as a threshold matter, meets this definition of public record. So really how it's kept, which FOIA talks about, that's the medium, whether it's a written piece of paper, whether it's an electronic record, audio, video. That's medium is the technical term under FOIA. Doesn't matter how that record's kept, okay? It can meet this definition regardless of how it's kept. It does have to be kept. We have questions, as you can imagine, particularly in today's day and age with electronic communication devices. You know, when is an email still kept? When is a text message still kept? You know, questions come up about that. Remember, I've got 30 minutes here, so I'm trying to keep this simple and throw out to you some of the issues that come up in what's a record. It has to be kept. And I mentioned that very important is when you're making a request, make sure you're asking for information as contained in records that you have. Because there's no obligation. You may get this thrown back at you. Custodians, and that's a technical term under FOIA, for the person who's responsible for handling records and requests and providing non-exempt public records, they don't have to create a record to respond to your FOIA request. FOIA is really not about question and answers, expecting somebody in the public sphere, governmental employee or official, to answer a question. Now, if they're a good public servant and they know the answer to the question and they're confident, they should probably answer it. But it's not a FOIA request. FOIA is about making a request, and obviously you're seeking information. It's the Freedom of Information Act. But it is seeking information through existing non-exempt public records. So the record has to be kept. It has to be something that's kept. And then, very importantly, this third step has to reflect, constitute, be a record of the performance or lack of performance of official functions. And I hit on this really hard when in our longer 2-hour presentation. By that time, you're probably kind of, going blind when Ray and I speak for 2 hours. But I spent a lot of time on this third element of what's a public record, because particularly when you're dealing, we see a lot of government officials coming to us frustrated by somebody wanting, I want all the emails of all your city council members for the past 5 years, on any device, whether it's public or private. And it's true, the device they're using doesn't matter. We don't think that matters. If you're, conducting public business on a personal device, potentially those records on your, we tell public officials all the time we're speaking to, potentially, you think that's a private device and that should be a private email, but if you're using that to conduct city or county or state business, it's potentially going to, if the record's still there, on that device, if it's still kept, if it reflects the performance or lack of performance, it's going to be a public record. But what does this make the custodian have to do? And this is why I try to emphasize too, for these voluminous requests, they've got to go through each record. We know that from case law. They can't just say, well, you use this device we know you use this device to conduct business, so we just get all your email. It's a content-based, record-by-record test. And I know that was very frustrating to the plaintiffs in this Pulaski County case years ago, and it went up and back on appeal, finally to the Arkansas Supreme Court, and the court said, no, that judge was supposed to look at each of those 600 plus emails and decide which one reflect the performance or lack of performance of official functions. So it's not a context-based test. It's not just because it was a public official and we know she was using her public, her private or public device, and there's email, and then she's doing business on that device. You got to look at each one. So I mentioned that to bear that in mind when you're making your FOIA request, to keep that in mind and make your request as succinct and narrow as you can.